Hello there, fellow YouTubers. Welcome to the 14th tutorial on beginning Java. Today we're going to be looking at inheritance. Now, if you remember in the last video, we dealt with classes and objects. Today we'll add another wrinkle, inheritance, as I just said. If you look at this diagram in the top here, in the previous video we created a class called Planet, and then we created objects from that template, Planet. If you didn't watch the previous video, if you remember, classes are reusable code. That is, we just don't have to type it over and over again if we want to reuse it. We can create objects by using shortcuts to the methods and variables in that class. So again, think of class as reusable code and specifically reusable methods and variables that we don't have to retype over if we want to reference them. Now, that top diagram, though, is not a realistic scenario, and that's where inheritance comes into play. Inheritance is when you start adding multiple classes. And what do these multiple classes have? They share a set of common characteristics. So if you take a look at that diagram below, that is a more realistic scenario. Now, I just talked about common characteristics. Well, candy has sugar, and so do gumdrops. So there's a couple points I want to make here about this bottom diagram. First is we call the candy class the superclass or parent class because it's on top of all the rest of the classes that are below it. And then all of the classes that we create below it are called the subclass or child class. So that would be the gumdrop class. And then we can get to our objects, as you see. So we're adding another layer of complexity, but it's really not that complex when you think of it. That is, if you think of it as an inheritance hierarchy. Now, in terms of the hierarchy, I also want to point out that your top class or superclass is always a generic class. And the lower you go, they get more and more specific. So, for instance, candy is pretty generic, and then gumdrops are more specific. So you wouldn't want to put gumdrops first and then create a subclass of candy below it. You just wouldn't do that. So again, the top class should always be your generic class, and then you work your way down in terms of specifics. The other point I'd like to make, which I just made, is they share common characteristics. And as we said, they share sugar. That's one of the common characteristics. So for instance, you wouldn't create a class called train and then create a class called gumdrop after that. Well, they don't share any common characteristics. Well, I mean, if you're in some strange world, maybe they do, but in this world, they don't. So I wanted to make that point as well. So if you take a look at this diagram, what we'll be doing in this tutorial is creating a set of methods and variables that the gumdrop class will inherit from the candy class. That is, we won't have to retype them out over and over again. And then the objects will be created from gumdrop, and we won't have to retype out the variables from gumdrop or candy. So that's the power of hierarchies. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a real inheritance structure here in NetBeans. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our new class. Now, obviously, we're going to start out with our superclass first because he's the guy we're going to be inheriting from when we create our subclass. So, as always, we go to New File, and we're going to go ahead and select Empty Java File, and we're going to name our superclass Candy. So we are following that diagram to the letter. And let's define that class here. And let's go ahead and give this a comment here, and we'll say this is our superclass. Now, if you remember in the previous tutorial, I said every class should have an attribute and a behavior, and the attribute is essentially a variable. So let's go ahead and give an attribute here of sugar amount. Remember in the diagram we said candy and gumdrops share a common characteristic in sugar, and we're just going to hit semicolon. So there we go for that. So now we're going to give this class a behavior or method. So we're going to go ahead and type in the usual public void, and we're going to call this method display sugar amount. There you go. And let's create the squiggly brackets so we can create our code, what this method is going to do, what this behavior is going to do, if you want to think of it like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a system.out.print here, which we've done in many tutorials. Actually, we'll do a line break. We'll do open paren, and let's print out a text string here, and we're going to say sugar amount is space. And then we're going to go ahead and add that variable amount that we defined up here, whatever it is we use later on in our object. Again, we're not giving it a value here. We're just going to go ahead and add it to this string when we define the value later on. And that, of course, is sugar amount. And once again, I'd also like to point out, remember in the last video that we said that our class templates do not have a main method. This is just reusable code. This isn't a program itself, so keep that in mind. We're not going to give it a main method here. We will do that when we create our program to create our objects from this class template. So let's move on and let's create our subclass now. And we'll call this class, you guessed it, Gumdrops. Now here comes the key point to this whole video. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I tie the subclass to the superclass? You do that by the extend statement. This is where the Gumdrops class becomes the child of the parent class or superclass Candy. Again, we use the extend statement. So let's go ahead and do that now. It's the first statement that we'll put in. So we'll use the usual public keyword. Now this is where we define the subclass, which is Gumdrops. And this is where we use the extends keyword. So we go extends, and it's going to be our Candy superclass. So to review this really quickly, Gumdrops always comes first. The subclass always comes first, and then the superclass comes after the extends parameter. So Gumdrops extends Candy, inherits everything from Candy. That's what ties Gumdrops to Candy. Okay, good. So let's move on. And before we do that, let's just put in our usual comment. This is a subclass. Spelling it wrong yet again. Terrible typer, as you guys can see. Okay, so now we need to define some attributes of Gumdrops. Specifically, what are the flavors of Gumdrops? Well, I can think of a few. Let's give this first one cinnamon. And we're going to give that a string of cinnamon. Great. And then let's think of another one here. Oh wow, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. And let's go ahead and define another attribute here, another type of gumdrop. Let's go with, isn't there spearmint? Okay, whoops, again, no. So there we have our flavors defined. Now we need to give this class some methods, some things to do, some behaviors. So we'll go void give me cinnamon. And let's have this method do the following behavior. We're going to do a system.out.println, and let's print out a string. And we'll say this is a cinnamon, and then we're going to go ahead and add the variable that we have here, which was cinnamon. And then we'll do another string. Whoa, that's way wrong. And we want to give this spaces here so this prints out in a nice, neat sentence. So let's create a method for the spearmint flavor. And we can just go ahead and copy and paste this so we don't have to keep doing this over and over again. So there we go. We've got our gumdrop subclass now, which is inheriting the behaviors and variables that we defined in Candy. So now we can go ahead and create our program, which is going to create some gumdrop objects from these two classes that we defined. And let's call this inheritance program. And we'll do the usual public class keywords, of course. And let's put in our comments. This is the actual program. And now let's put in our main method. Well, that's going to look pretty similar to you guys. Now, remember what I said before was that the main method goes in the program. We do not put it in our classes. So now we can go ahead and create some gumdrop objects. And let's do that. So if you remember in the previous tutorial, we specified the gumdrops class first, followed by the name of the object that we want to call this. Now, when I was younger, we referred to those as red gumdrops, so let's call this red. And I need to capitalize that D, actually, otherwise we'll get IntelliSense problems. And we will use the new keyword to say this is a new object based off the gumdrops class. And we will type in gumdrops again. And let's do the same thing for the spearmint flavor. Let's go ahead and create a green gumdrop. We're going to give this new object based off the gumdrops class the name of green. So now let's go ahead and have these objects do some things. So let's go ahead and do red dot, And let's go ahead and give me cinnamon. So we're pulling this method, using this method that we don't have to retype out from the gumdrops class that we defined. Now let's go ahead and give it a sugar amount. And you'll see that is right here. There we go. And we're going to say that is equal to 10 grains of sugar. So let's go ahead and review what's going on here. We created this object off the gumdrops class template. And we're going to go ahead and use the method that we defined here from that class. We don't have to retype the whole method out. We can just use a shortcut, which is give me cinnamon. Next, we're going to go ahead and use the sugar amount, which we're getting from the overall superclass of candy, because gumdrops inherited that from candy. We're able to do that. Remember, this object came from the gumdrops class, and that gives it access to this superclass. And let me show you that. Let's go ahead and get rid of this extends here. And you'll notice we should get IntelliSense, and we do. It no longer knows about that because it can't get to it, because this is no longer inheriting the sugar amount. So if we stick that back here, now we have access to it. You see how that works? Then we need to go ahead and use the method from the superclass, which was, if you remember, display sugar amount. So we're going to go ahead and use our object here, our red gumdrop object. And we'll go ahead and display the sugar amount. And so let's go ahead and run this now. And there you see we've got our cinnamon gumdrop, and the sugar amount is 10. Oh, but now we want to go ahead and add another object to this. We want to go ahead and get a spearmint gumdrop. So let's do that. So it'll be pretty much the same deal. We're just going to go green dot give me spearmint. And we're going to go ahead and give this a sugar amount. And let's say here that there's only 9 grains of sugar in the spearmint flavor. It's not quite as deadly. Okay, and so you see how this works, guys? It's so much easier to go ahead and use these quick references rather than having to type this code all out again. Much easier to use. And then we have to go ahead and display the sugar amount. Whoops. We're using green dot. And let's go ahead and display that. And now let's run this, and now we've got 2 gumdrops. We should get, we got a spearmint, a cinnamon, and it even came with the sugar amount that goes in each one of them, because they all have sugar, right? Okay, so let's flip back to the slide here for a second, and you can see this has changed. Before we close this video out, I want to show you now, if you take a look here, so you can see how you could start adding other classes here. We could create a new class called Jelly Bean, and you could start creating objects off of that. And the key is we do not have to recreate our superclass of candy. It's already there. We can just go ahead and start with the subclass. And so that's how this whole hierarchy thing works. So I hope you found this useful. Please check out the rest of my Java beginning tutorials on my YouTube channel, EJ Media. See you guys later.